the state. The Algerian case now provides strong empirical evidence for this argument. If winning means what the insurgents commonly say it means, then terrorism isn't the way to win. What about the second proposition, that fighting against terrorism isn't morally possible, that the number of civilian deaths will always be disproportionate? That is certainly contestable, though I don't think that the contest is at its center about proportionality. Years ago, when proportionality arguments usually went the other way and large numbers of civilian deaths were pronounced not disproportionate, I suggested that we should require positive efforts to avoid civilian deaths, whatever the results of our proportionality calculations. I argued for a revision of the classical doctrine of double effect, which held that civilian casualties were acceptable first if they were an unintended side effect of a legitimate military operation, and second if they passed the proportionality test. Since the second of these criteria didn't seem to me much of a test, we needed to strengthen the first. It wasn't enough not to intend civilian casualties. It was necessary to intend not to inflict such casualties. Two effects required two intentions. We should look for strategies and tactics designed, of course, to achieve their military objectives, but also designed to minimize death and injury to the civilian population. And those strategies and tactics might involve asking soldiers to take greater risks so as to reduce the risks they imposed on civilians. There are also negative responsibilities that come ahead of proportionality. States and armies and insurgent organizations must not deliberately put civilians in harm's way. They must not use civilians as shields in military operations, pushing them ahead of a scouting party, setting up a daycare center in a munitions factory, firing mortars or rockets from churches or schools, storing military supplies in apartment buildings. These are impermissible acts without regard to proportionality calculations. It isn't possible to argue that the number of children who might be killed if the munitions factory is bombed is not disproportionate to the value of deterring the attack. The children shouldn't be there. And it is the people who put them there, not the people who attack the factory, who are responsible for their deaths. It isn't clear to me, this is perhaps something we should talk about, how the children should figure in the proportionality calculations of the attacking force. Civilians being used by fighters are no longer disengaged from the business of war, even though they will still look innocent to us, and perhaps especially innocent. The calculations shift, though I don't know how far, in favor of the attackers who won't be responsible for the deaths they cause. Still, they might well look for a way of attacking when the children aren't there. The issue is much clearer with regard to civilians living around the factory who are always there. Now the attackers are responsible for the deaths they cause if they don't take care and if they don't take risks to minimize the collateral damage they know they will inflict. Now, that argument was meant for soldiers and insurgents alike. Its primary purpose in 1977 was to deal with the permissiveness of the old proportionality doctrine. But the current version of the doctrine permits hardly anything in the way of collateral damage. And if one combines a newly restrictive proportionality doctrine with a requirement of positive and perhaps risky efforts to protect civilians, and then with a negative responsibility not to endanger them, the resulting moral code, according to many soldiers and insurgents too, makes it impossible to fight successfully so long as one honors the code. And since the people who honor the code are presumably the good guys, there seems to be something wrong here. Now, some critics of just war theory argue that the wrongness has to do with the conventional claim that jus in bello is entirely independent of jus ad bellum, that fighters on both sides, whether their cause is just or unjust, have an equal right to fight and are equally bound to fight justly, that is, in accordance with the rules of engagement. But if the rules make it impossible for either side to win, these critics argue, then surely they must be relaxed for the side that ought to win. The ad bellum just warriors must be given some leeway with regard to in bello justice. John Rawls made an argument something like this in A Theory of Justice, his great book. He said, even in a just war, certain forms of violence are strictly inadmissible. And when a country's right to fight is questionable and uncertain, the constraints on the means it can use are all the more severe. Acts permissible in a war of legitimate self-defense, when those are necessary, may be flatly excluded in a more doubtful situation. Now, it's not a morally crazy argument. You can see where it is coming from. It's coming from men and women who are confident that they know which side ought to win. With regard to many actual conflicts, I share that confidence. I know which side ought to win. The problem is that it's very widely shared among people on both sides of pretty much every symmetrical and asymmetrical war. On both sides, the arguments are made with fierceness and conviction. We are fighting for national liberation. We are fighting in self-defense. We are fighting against terrorists. We are fighting for justice and peace. And so both sides are ready, equally ready, to claim the benefits of any relaxation of the rules. That's the old, and it still seems to me, unanswerable argument in favor of the conventional independence of in bello from ad bellum justice. There won't be any rules at all unless they apply in the same way to both sides. So if one side can't win following the rules, neither can the other side. But the rules are designed to make fighting and winning possible. They aren't pacifist rules. They are rules of war. They are rules for war. The design does, however, have a built-in limit. If the war can't be won according to the rules, then there is a probability, not a certainty, a probability that it shouldn't be won. The inability to fight justly is a sign that the war itself isn't just. In the 1960s and 70s, I made an argument of this sort against our war in Vietnam. I thought that war unjust from the beginning, but that was certainly not an obvious position. There were strong arguments in favor of the war. It was, after all, a war against communist tyranny. Its injustice was confirmed, I argued, when it became clear that we were not fighting only against the communists. We were helplessly at war with the rural society of Vietnam. The capacity of American soldiers to distinguish the insurgents from ordinary Vietnamese was steadily diminishing until pretty much every Vietnamese man, woman, and child looked like an enemy, looked plausibly like an enemy. The insurgents had won the hearts and minds battle, and whether or not the American war was initially unjust, it had become unjust. Now, that didn't justify Viet Cong violations of the rules of war. The rules applied to them exactly as they applied to the Americans. But the way we were forced to fight demonstrated pretty conclusively, I thought, that we should stop fighting. So the ad bellum, in bello distinction isn't absolute. Fighting a just war doesn't give you privileges vis-a-vis jus in bello. But fighting unjustly, being unable to fight justly, may in some cases deprivilege you vis-a-vis jus ad bellum. But how can this be a one-way argument, only from in bello to ad bellum? The hard question is whether the argument can ever go the other way. If we'd been fighting in self-defense in Vietnam, that is, against a real threat to the physical safety of American citizens, would our inability to fight justly have required us to stop fighting? Possibly not. I'll come back to that question. But America in Vietnam isn't a good case for addressing it, since our inability to fight justly was a function of fighting far from home in someone else's country on behalf of a very unpopular government for strategic reasons that had little to do with the physical security of American citizens. So let's consider the position of the Viet Cong, whose fighters were fighting in their own country. I said just now that they had no exemption from the rules of war. Suppose, however, that they couldn't win their fight, let's say for national liberation, without large-scale violations of the rules, without killing as many Vietnamese as the Americans were killing. Would we have to say then that the rules of war forbade their victory, made national liberation impossible? I think yes, we would have to say that, for their inability to fight justly would have been a sign that they had not won the hearts and minds battle. Now the old argument against terrorism would apply to them. They were an elite band of killers without popular support. I think we need a different and a harder case to test the good guys can't win argument. So let's turn to the Israeli war in Gaza in 2008, which is probably the sort of case many people have in mind, or Afghanistan is a similar case, when they challenge the current rules of war. Now, here's the case in simplified outline, without reference to Israel's occupation of Gaza in 1967 or its withdrawal in 2004, or the Hamas coup and the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Hamas militants had for some years fired rockets indiscriminately into Israel, hoping to kill large numbers of civilians, but with virtually no success. Since they fired at least some of the time from civilian cover, any Israeli response was bound to be problematic given the proportionality rule. Whether the attack was from the air or on the ground, it would kill many more civilians than the rockets were killing. And that would be called, and was in fact called, a disproportionate response. But what was being measured when this term was used? Disproportionate to what? Many people measured the deaths on one side against the deaths on the other, as if this was a family feud in Kentucky, and one family could kill two members of the second family, and so the second family got to kill two members of the first family, and then everybody went home. But this was obviously not a family feud. The number of Israeli deaths was very low, though there was always the possibility that one of the Hamas rockets would hit a school or a hospital. Do potential deaths count in proportionality calculations? Or should the deaths on the Palestinian side be measured, as in standard proportionality arguments, against the value of the military target? Let's say one of the rocket launching teams. But hitting a single team wouldn't have much value to balance against the civilian deaths the attack would probably produce. Should we consider the targets and the deaths cumulatively? What is the military value of hitting many teams, stopping most of the rockets, making sure that no school or hospital would be blown up? The single team measure justifies very little in the way of civilian casualties, and indeed makes it difficult or impossible to fight. The cumulative multiple team measure can easily be made to justify too much. During and after the Gaza war, most international commentators wrote as if potential deaths didn't count, and the single team measure was the right one. And so, in effect, they denied the Israelis any rightful response to the rockets. That can't be right. But the alternative proportionality argument also can't be right. It would have justified more casualties than the Israeli army actually inflicted in the 36 days of the war. Hence, the need to think about the responsibility doctrine that I sketched a moment ago. When Hamas fires rockets into Israel, hoping to kill civilians, they are responsible for any civilians they kill. And when they fire from civilian cover, they are imposing risks on their own civilians